Stars are shining out for free. Now you're gone, I only feel the longing start here in my blue heart. Colors of my rainbow fade like the promises you made. There's only blue when I think of you. On and on the world goes by, dreamers passing through like a bird that cannot fly. All I want is you. Walking down an empty street, memories are bittersweet. Your joy and pain play a sad refrain. Hard to leave the past behind when two lovers' hearts entwine. Alone I cry here in my blue heart. On and on the world goes by, distant memories. When will your song of love let me go? When will I be free? On and on the world goes by, distant memories. When will your song of love let me go? When will I be free? Stars are shining out for free. Now you're gone, I only feel the longing start here in my blue heart. In my blue heart. Here in my blue heart. In my blue heart. My blue heart.
1, 2, 3, raz, 2, 3. Hej, 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 1, raz, 2, 3. Raz, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Raz, 2, 3. Hej, hej, hej. Hej, 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 1, 2, 3.
Turn it up. How do I turn it up? Here?
Salvation knocks upon your door. 'Cause you've been running around in circles, repeating all the same mistakes, leaving all your problems behind you again and again. You might think that life is always
Hello. Sorry. Hello. Let's try this again. Okay. I think it works. Hello. All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to Radical Exchange. I'm Paula Berman. I'm COO of RadicalxChange Foundation. And I want to start this out by thanking the Golem Foundation team for helping make this happen. We're so honored to be here and working with the Golem team for the past few months to create this event for you has been very, very special. And the idea for today is to create a space for us to talk about European institutions and pluralism. Pluralism is a very important value for us at Radical Exchange. It guides everything that we do. And summarizing it, it's all about recognizing and fostering cooperation across diversity. So the idea for today is to think about this rapidly changing world and how we can come together and step up to the power of diverse cooperation and embrace it. So we're going to do that today, exploring pluralism from multiple diverse perspectives. We're going to be sharing and learning about pioneering digital democracies in Eastern Europe and trying to understand what is possible when information technology is combined with social technology. We're going to look into works of art and how they can become windows for connection with others. We're going to hear from activists, social fabric weavers, and critical voices, and we're going to examine European institutions through the frame of pluralistic governance. And lastly, we'll look into the future and consider European cases for plural currencies, data cooperatives, decentralized identity systems, new communication tools, and other pro-social digital infrastructure and civic technology. This diversity of perspectives is crucial because today we're going to have a radical exchange. And by radical, we mean things that are actually changing the world. It's not radical to critique our society, but it's radical to build a better one. So today we're going to have with us artists, activists, social leaders, technologists, who are not only developing transformational ideas, but are also putting them into practice. And too often, when we do radical work, we feel isolated. We don't see that there are many others who are working on the same challenges, but approaching them from different perspectives. And that's a problem because when we only connect with those who are similar to us, it's too easy to become ignorant of our own blind spots. Similar people make similar mistakes, whereas diversity breeds stronger ideas. So for the next 8 hours, all of us here in this room are going to come with our diverse perspectives, citizenships, views, and skills, and we're going to exchange with each other. Our panelists and our speakers are going to share their work and experience, and I invite you to ask them questions, to test their assumptions, to point out patterns that had not been identified before. Because radical exchange is a movement, it's always changing, and many of the ideas that you hear about today only came forward because someone made a question, someone asked a question, someone made a critique, and most importantly, someone made a contribution. So for today, let's be here as active participants and co-create this day together. And to get us started, I'd like to invite our friends from Golem Foundation and Julian Zawistowski to share a little bit about the intentions for creating this space today.
Thank you. I will try to be brief. So I think I owe you an explanation, like why we are doing this, why we thought that bringing radical exchange to Warsaw might be just a great idea. If you heard about us, you know. If you haven't, then you don't know that Golem Foundation is very much technology-oriented organization. So much technology-oriented that the technology we produce is like not in a wide adoption yet. Yet we are working on a number of interesting things, of which Wildland, I think, is at the moment most promising, so I invite you to check it out. But apart from like being very techy, we also consider our space, the centralized space, Web3 space, like blockchain space, as a potential sandbox of social and governance innovations. And while we are usually very closed in our bubble, I think, which is not good, with all the recent events in the world, we thought that maybe it would be useful to bring some new ideas and try to connect different communities around the idea of a social change, of better cooperation between humans, and around solving the most pressing issues of today's world. And that's why we thought that from the space we are in, the most interesting thing to show to our fellow citizens of Warsaw, Poland, and Europe is RadicalxChange. And that's how the idea of bringing these people, these ideas here came to be. So I hope you will find that as exciting as I find it, and I invite you to enjoy the whole day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. And now I'd like to invite to the stage my colleagues Matt Prewitt and Jack Henderson. Matt is president of RadicalxChange Foundation, and Jack is a researcher of digital democracy and the weaver behind everything that you'll see today. And they're going to talk about a topic in economics called increasing returns, which you might not have heard about before, but it's very, very central to what we do at RadicalxChange. So I know that you will enjoy it, and I will hand it over to my colleagues for them to share that with you.
Thank you very much, Paula. And big thanks to the Golem Foundation and the Wildland team. We're very, very grateful to be here, and happy to be able to connect with all of you about the interesting work that we're doing. Sorry, let me just get this sort of adjusted. So what I'd really like to do is just give a little bit of context and a general introduction to the work of RadicalxChange and RadicalxChange Foundation. It's possible that you have heard of us before if you're a follower of Vitalik Buterin, who is a prominent technologist who's interested in the kinds of ideas that we're working on. You may have read the book Radical Markets, which was co-authored by our founder Glenn Weil. This is a book that has a number of really interesting ideas about the reform of sort of basic institutions in democracy and markets that helped sort of inspire the project of RadicalxChange and the community that we're trying to bring together. But in a more general sense, what RadicalxChange is doing is trying to bring together a community of people around the world who can articulate a way forward for democracy and democratic institutions that can survive into the 21st century and survive against the many complex and obviously extremely serious threats to the future of a democratic and sort of pluralistic way of life and way of organizing society. Part of the challenge, I think, in articulating this kind of vision is that in a way it is a narrow path, and it's harder in some ways to articulate how what the values are and what the sort of path forward is in terms of institutions and in terms of technology that can maintain a democratic society. But I hope to present some of our ideas here and give you a sense of why we think that basically the way forward for democracy depends on quite radical thinking and on quite you know, hopefully a really collaborative and international effort to experiment with new institutions and new technologies that can carry forward a way of organizing society that has room for many different viewpoints and that we will all enjoy living in. This presentation, the brief presentation, is I've called it "Why Democracy is So Hard and Why Its Future Depends on Plurality." I'll take you through some sort of general ideas, and then within the context of a brief presentation, I want to try to talk a little bit about some of the sort of specific ideas that RadicalxChange has helped develop and is helping to experiment with in technical in the context of governance of technical systems and in the context of new governance institutions. So this is a picture of George Orwell. George Orwell, I'm sure you're all familiar, is you know, a great British author. When he was young, he was a conventional, old-school democratic socialist. He had a commitment to essentially democratic, left-leaning values, and motivated by these values, in the 1930s, he went to Spain to fight in the Civil War and join the cause of the Republican cause. And when he got there, he was initially extremely inspired by the sort of diverse coalition of people there. He felt that the Republican cause in Spain was bringing together the sort of future of society. But after a bit of time, he became a little bit disillusioned. This next picture is a picture from the Monty Python film Life of Brian, which some of you may have seen, which shows this is these folks are in the film the Judean People's Front, and their main purpose is to get the Roman Empire out of Judea. But their main problem is that even more than they hate the Roman Empire, the Judean People's Front hates the People's Front of Judea and the Popular People's Judean Front, and so on and so forth. So they're basically riven by internal division and incapable of organizing around the real goals that they want to. And in many ways, this was precisely the problem that George Orwell encountered in his participation in the Republican cause in Spain. There was incredible internal division. It wasn't just, you know, I mean, in Monty Python, it's a joke, but in real life, it led the cause to fail. And, you know, Spain Franco won the war, and Spain endured decades of fascism, and the fascist movements in Germany and Italy and elsewhere were strengthened by this development. And so it's a real problem. Meanwhile, George Orwell looked elsewhere, and he saw that the socialist causes that were succeeding were totalitarian, right? The socialists who had been able to win their conflicts were organized in an authoritarian, autocratic way, like Stalin. And so George Orwell became very pessimistic, basically. You know, and his final great work was the book 1984, which is this incredibly dark dystopian novel that really doesn't provide much of an inspiring or optimistic path forward. And so I think that George Orwell still has, like, his way of understanding the world still has incredibly important lessons for us today. And one of them, I think, is that in many societies we're really preoccupied by this sort of left-right political spectrum from political to conservative, or from progressive to conservative. And there's a lot at stake in this, and it's not that it isn't important, it's not that we shouldn't be focused on this, but there is basically an orthogonal political spectrum from democratic to autocratic. And I think that, you know, what I would like to argue, and I think what Orwell ended up agreeing with, is that in many ways this orthogonal axis is really even more important than the other one. And focusing on moving towards a more democratic form of society is really more critical to the basic level of to the basic sort of welfare of society than the other thing. but it's really, really difficult. And one of the reasons it's difficult is that I want to sort of gesture towards this idea of instability. So I mean, the real difficulty for democratic movements, I think, is that when they sort of move far to the progressive end or far to the conservative end, it becomes more difficult to organize democratically. It becomes more difficult to maintain a democratic coalition. And so, you know, movements, you know, strong movements along the progressive and conservative dimensions end up sort of pushing the coalition into instability and creating this temptation towards more autocratic forms. And I think that what we really need to be thinking about, what I would argue is at least for me, the cause that I want to dedicate myself to is more about sort of moving back up this, you know, this axis. You know, instead of getting caught in sort of stable but unattractive autocratic forms, or, you know, indeed, instead of being sort of satisfied with technocratic but sort of non-participatory and often elitist forms of, you know, sort of technocratic government, I think it's really important to think about ways to basically push back upwards towards a participatory and democratic form of government. So that's kind of that's a very general framing, but in certain ways it presents huge difficulties, because if you're arguing that democracy is more important than these other kinds of political commitments, in a way it can feel like empty of content, right? So the question is whether is this vision of plurality empty of the kind of values, empty of the kind of substantial values that are on offer in progressive or conservative politics? And I think that the answer is no, but we need really better ways of articulating that, and better ways of inspiring people about that and organizing around that, I think, in order to maintain 21st century democratic movements. So plurality is not content free, right? It's really about respecting other people, respecting the different views about how society ought to be organized. And even more fundamentally than that, I think it's about sharing power. It's about thinking about mechanisms and systems of sharing power in society over scarce resources, over land, over the sort of technical infrastructure that controls our lives, you know, that kind of respect for others and allowing other people into participation in power is indeed a radical thing, and I think a thing that ought to be able to inspire a new sort of politics and a new sort of way of thinking about technical building. But the question is whether our tools are up to the task. So how do we actually do this sort of power sharing thing? And if we look at the way our societies are organized, we have a couple, you know, broadly speaking, we have a couple primary sort of methods, a couple primary tools for sharing power. So one of them is markets. This is a picture of a market, right? In a way, markets are things that in an ideal sense put everybody on even footing. Nobody's coerced to take any particular actions. Things are sort of put into buckets of property rights, and it's assumed that we can all sort of interact on even footing within that framework. Another important system of power sharing is voting, right? So voting is another system where everyone's put on the same footing, everyone's input is considered equally, and through votes, people govern shared institutions. But really, one must admit that these systems are failing, right? So, you know, markets are not doing, you know, capitalism is not accomplishing what it needs to accomplish, right? This system is not leading us to solve the major problems of our time. Where, you know, the capitalism is not obviously generating solutions to the problems like climate, other kinds of global problems. It's leading to inequality. It's leading to sort of speculative dynamics. It just isn't the way that it's set up right now just does not seem to be adequate. And similarly, voting isn't working as well as it's supposed to be, right? Voting is leading to division and polarization, and we're having trouble sort of using this this system to lead to the kind of intelligent deliberation and participation in power that that in its deepest ideals it points towards. So what Radical Exchange is focused on is in part taking ideas from economics and academia and mechanism design to propose sort of better ways of doing these fundamental things in society, like sharing power through voting and sharing power through markets. Our work really goes beyond that, but I think it's useful to understand as sort of a foundation to Radical Exchange's thinking, what some of our basic ideas are for how to reform things like property, things like voting, things like the way that public goods are funded, things like data governance, money, identity systems. And again, I want to point out that I think that in order to make these systems of power sharing work, in order to make democracy and plurality sustainable, it's important not to get too caught up in tradition. I think it's important not to cling too tightly to the way that these institutions have been defined in the past, and to embrace a spirit of really quite urgent experimentation, and to take really, basically radical ways of rethinking how we might do property, how we might do voting, and to work within our communities and within our institutions and within our societies to refine these kinds of radical ideas and come to better solutions that might be able to evolve with the necessary speed and respond with the necessary urgency to the huge problems we face. So I don't have enough time to get deeply into this stuff, but one of the major areas that we work with is property. So basically rethinking the fundamental sort of concept of private property. How can we sort of redesign the rights and the interests that attach to private property systems in ways that make them not only more just, but also more efficient, and that sort of share the wealth of society in a more intelligent way. So this is I guess you can't read it there, but this is a sign put up by a follower of Henry George. Henry George was a 19th century American economist and land reformer who had this really, really deep insight about where the value of land comes from. And his insight was essentially that, barring the sort of improvements on land, if you just think about the value of private property in a piece of the ground, the way that appreciates, the way that value accrues to that kind of thing, that value comes from public infrastructure investments, and it comes from the sort of network of sociality and exchange and culture around the land, not from anything that the financial owner of the land does. So in a way, the sort of the problem of monopoly is replicated in this very, very fundamental idea of property ownership in land. So Henry George wanted to think about ways of essentially redistributing the appreciation in land values in order to not only for purposes of justice, but also for purposes of inspiring more sort of productive investment and development. And one of the big things that Radical Exchange is interested in is kind of modernized ways of doing this kind of thing, modernized ways of thinking about licensing structures and power sharing over infrastructure that accomplish this end of sort of recycling back into broad networks of people the value that otherwise accrues to individual investors and leads to wealth concentration and other things. Another fundamental idea that we work with is something called quadratic voting, which is a way of rethinking essentially the way that ballots are structured, the way that information is passed from large numbers of people to a democratic government. So you can sort of think of, if you think of voting systems as a kind of an informational conduit, traditional voting systems really only contain information about, what direction people prefer. Do you prefer A or do you prefer B? They're very bad at capturing information about the strength of preference. Because they don't capture information about the strength of preference, they don't allow for more nuanced and more complex compromises in large systems of voting. And quadratic voting is a way of a very clever way of simply restructuring the way that we pass information through votes that sort of solves an interesting game theoretical problem and allows people to express their strength of preference without creating an incentive for everybody to sort of yell at the top of their lungs and enabling society to make more nuanced compromises. This is a formula for quadratic funding, which is it's a representation of a very similar idea to quadratic funding. That is an interesting way of enabling really broad participation in decisions about what kinds of infrastructure and what kinds of public goods get funded. This is a quick representation of some of our thinking about institutions for shared data governance, which is another sort of really fundamental problem that needs to be solved in a better way for democracy and for markets to function well into the 21st century. So a lot of our work is quite sort of theoretical. We're working with really abstract ideas, but it's actually I want to emphasize that what we're doing is taking these ideas and putting them into practice and building like a real network of people around the world who are capable of refining these kinds of things and putting them into practice in the governance of institutions. So all of this stuff, like sort of reimagined property systems and quadratic voting, it's not like these are not like off-the-shelf solutions. What these are like really high potential, interesting building blocks with which we can experiment to build better institutions. And what the Radical Exchange community around the world, what I hope it can accomplish is to build connections between people who can assist one another in this kind of experimentation in real contexts. So one of the things that Radical Exchange Foundation has done is we've built this really interesting tool called Radical Exchange Voice, which combines the sort of tools for hosting conversations at large scale, surfacing and refining interesting ideas, and then feeding those into quadratic voting processes. This is something that can be used for complex governance problems like the ones that are faced by blockchain communities who are trying to figure out how to get large numbers of people to make decisions together. And it can also be used in things like cooperatives and governments and communities and all sorts of other bottom-up democratic institutions. We also work with like real governments. So this is a picture of the City Council of Nashville, Tennessee. We worked with them to do to actually use quadratic voting to prioritize different items in their budget for the next year. We've done similar work in different parts of the state of Colorado, in cities and states in Brazil, and in many kind of private contexts and technical networks who are trying to solve governance problems. A lot of the work that we do kind of feeds in and out of the really amazing work of Audrey Tang in Taiwan, who's leading, perhaps the most exciting and well-developed work in government level digital democracy in the world. This is a picture of a conversation on Polis that occurred in Taiwan, in which sort of different ideas for legislative proposals are sort of surfaced and processed and by like a large number of online participants and fed into more consensus building legislative processes. This is a picture of a song contest in China where this had nothing to do with government, just people deciding which singer they liked the best. They used quadratic voting in like a nationwide survey. This is a picture of this is depicting a program called Gitcoin Grants, which is an interesting blockchain-based process using quadratic funding to fund open source software. So it's probably at least tens, maybe more than $100 million at this point have been passed through the Gitcoin grants system, allowing this kind of democratic process of allocation of funding for public goods. So that's I don't have time to go into more. I'd love to talk to any of you throughout the day in a little bit more depth. But this is a flavor of the kind of things that we're working on. I'll stop there. But I'm looking forward to developing these things and really proud to be able to bring together so many amazing people today who are thinking about kind of innovation in institutions in many different societies. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. And you can stay here because we're about to start our next panel. Or sorry, should we go ahead or do we have a break? We go ahead, okay. So our next panel is about imagining how democracy could work. We want to take a moment to zoom out and think big picture about democracy. We're going through a critical time in history where our social institutions that were built in the past are not really meeting the moment. And we know that, but we have a hard time understanding how these social institutions can be improved. So there's a data point that for generations born before World War II, about 70% think that it's essential to live in a democracy, whereas for millennials, that number is just under 30%. So this means that we have to make democracy recognizably viable again, especially to young people, but for everyone. And to do that, it takes the recognition that democracy is not just an ideal, but it is a social technology that is in need and capable of evolution in many of the ways that Matt was describing and other ways as well. So in this panel, we're going to talk about how democracy to come could work and what it can look and feel like and how this imagination can inform the steps that we're going to take today. And so with that, I'll hand it over to our moderator, Matt Prewitt, and he's going to introduce our amazing panelists.
Thanks, Paula. We'd love to invite our panelists up, Juha, Kazimierz, and Stav.
All right, so first of all, I want to thank you all again. Thanks so much for joining us in this conversation. Really honored to be speaking with you all today. Feel free to tell us a bit more about your work, and I'll as we get started. But Very, very privileged to be joined by Stav Shaffir, who's I believe the youngest woman to be elected to the Israeli Knesset, and a leader of an incredibly inspiring major social movement in Tel Aviv concerning the high cost of housing and a number of other social issues. About a decade ago, which is really one of the most successful examples of organizing in recent years. Juha Leppänen is the chief executive of Demos Helsinki, which is a really amazing consultancy and think tank that is doing some of the most innovative democracy work around the world. And Kazimierz Popławski is the founder of the Baltic Review, an expert and a scholar in the really amazing digital democracy and sort of e-democracy work that has gone on in Estonia in recent years. So thank you all so much for being here. And I think the question that I would like to start off with is, in addition to, feel free to sort of tell us a little bit more about your own work and what how it connects to this problem. But I would love to hear from each of you about sort of why you think democracy is so difficult and why you think it's under such unique pressures in recent years and what we might do about it.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really love your work at RadicalxChange. I'm looking forward to see the new innovations that you will come with. I think, the rise of populists that, after being elected, damage democracy in so many ways is not a new phenomenon. So, we're in a place where we know it happens. It happens everywhere. Sadly, we're not learning fast enough as citizens how to cope with these extremists when they try to take over and occupy power just in order to damage democracy. However, I think that there are other reasons why democracy was weakened in the last decade or even 2 decades already. Our generation that grew up into a technological world, we have internet access since we're like 5. We're used to having information in our hands, and the way of thinking of information is something that belongs to us. We want to have access, we want to have more control over our lives, but our political systems don't behave in the same way. Actually, they behave very much the opposite. They're very slow to progress, to adopt new technologies. They're very much left behind. So it's the public that is way ahead, like 1,000 steps ahead. But politicians and political systems that are left behind, not acting. So the average citizen is left with one option to influence in his or her eyes, which is to go and vote once in 4 years, if you're lucky. We in Israel do it very often, like once in 6 months. But that vote alone is not really influence. We don't feel like it's influencing anything in our lives. And I think that disappointment, together with the rise of social media, where we're becoming much more aware of what politicians are actually doing, and the disappointment from the way the decisions are being made, led to a huge disappointment of democracy itself. So we hear more and more voices, even in more like liberal societies, against the essence of democracy, like it's not really working. And I think the way to move forward is for these systems to start and advance in different and creative ways. And it takes a lot of experimentation. It's not going to happen with, by using, and I was in politics for 8 years. Sadly, a lot of what I saw that was that politicians were constantly trying to learn from really the oldest guards in the in the place, like adopting the same systems again and again and again that were already tried before, didn't succeed. We need new systems, and we need to change the way that we think about democracy. We need to look at it as an active, innovative force. It needs to happen every day in our lives. It needs to start early in our education, with democratic schools and democratic education, with the encouragement of the ability to make decisions and to learn to depth the core ideas behind these decisions. Because if you just vote on an idea, even in a referendum, like the example we had in Brexit, where Brexit was, the vote was defined in a 52 to 48% gap. But a day after the vote, the second most asked question on Google by people in Britain was, what is the EU? If people vote about something, but they don't know what they vote on, they're not actually using their power. It actually goes against their own interest and their own civil power. That's not democracy. It's not what it's supposed to be. So we need to start this training very, very early on, when I think we need to start it in our cities. We need to which have the highest potential of having people involved in their day-to-day lives, so in the definition of their education, in the definition of the roads, in planning, like urban planning can be dominated and led by the people who actually live in the city and not by outsiders or you know, just by the professionals. It should be by the residents. And if we encourage people to do that and get them the activization in their day-to-day lives about how it can be done and can show fruits in their realities, I think it will encourage them to act more also on the national level and use the democracy in ways that we still haven't seen.
Super, thank you. Juha?
No, super good. Few reflections on that, and really privileged to be here, which is a super beautiful setup. Very, very, very lovely. So perhaps two perspectives to follow up on that point. One, well, first of all, I think we're dealing with very fundamentals of democracies, like the most basic questions that we've always dealt with when we talk about democracies. And one, so to me, democracy is one very particular way of orchestrating collective action. And one aspect of that collective action is problem solving. And on that, there are many different, more detailed aspects to it. But one is that if you look at our democracies, many of the issues that we're dealing with today escape their boundaries in a way, whether it's local, whether it's national. For instance, the climate crisis. And what that leads very easily in is a decline in agency. And that then leads into a decline in accountability. And it's a really particular dynamic. I remember very well when the discussions on future work were high everywhere, basically, around 8-9 years ago. And we did a project with our government and basically the key institutions in the Finnish society on work. And we launched that. And all of those institutions said that there's nothing we can do about this. There's nothing we can influence. There's nothing we can take accountability of in terms of fragmentation of jobs, for instance. So, and then you wonder why there's a decline of trust in those institutions. So there's that very fundament in terms of whether the modality of governance is capable of achieving what needs to be achieved in terms of solving the problems that we have today. But then, of course, collective action is more about solving problems. It's also about co-living. And there, I think, in a way, with democracy, we've a bit forgotten about both the strengths and weaknesses of democracy, which is that it's a very messy process. But at the same time, societies are fundamentally very messy, as they are. And in a way, during the past 20 years, a lot of the ways to answer to that decline of trust in democracies has been to put in place, for instance, participation methodologies, which then are on the fringes of the actual decisions and how we actually shape where we're heading collectively, which then leads easily into very banal examples of basically voting for putting in place a very specific park, for instance. And there's nothing wrong with parks, but it's much more about like what are the fundamentals of democracy and where the real power lies. And if we look at historically, democracies thrive when there is a process of imagination, debate, and experimentation, not just on the society, but on democracy itself. So partially, I think the reason why we're seeing a decline on democracies and trust in democracies is that we've forgotten to apply the very basic principles of democracy into the democratic process itself. Professor Roberto Mangapera Unger would refer to this as the dictatorship of no alternatives, which is very much self-imposed. And that, to me, is the biggest question. How do we exactly bring up that process of imagining collective life and action and share that power equally?
Super. Kazimierz.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. If we talk about democracy from Polish and Estonian perspective, I would argue with the previous argument of yours, I guess, or that society doesn't trust in democracy. If you would ask Polish people or Estonian people, majority of them would answer that we want to live in democracy. But that does not necessarily mean that we vote in a way that we ensure preserving democracy in our countries. As anywhere else in Europe or in the world, we have these populistic movements that are actually using democracy in order to limit of influence of societies on politics. And then there is a question on technology. And I think that, of course, private sector, society, people are using technology in very wide extent. And we could argue that private sector is way ahead of public sector, of politics and politicians. But if you would analyze elections in US, in different countries in Europe, in Brexit, then you could see that actually those actors are employing technology in order to obtain power and maybe limit our democratic rights. So technology is not necessarily an answer to our current struggle. And coming back to a Central European perspective, Poland in particularly, there is big question of obeying the law, the rule of law, basically, and how political actors using this in order to limit our rights, democratic rights. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. One I think interesting theory for the difficulties that democracy has been having recently, and for the role of technology in these, is that if you just sort of think of democracy as like an information system, if you think of in terms of information being passed from participants in democracy to whatever the sort of governed entity is, technology has increased the flows of information. It's made it much easier for lots and lots of information to inform all kinds of institutions, but private institutions and non-democratic institutions have had a much easier time taking advantage of that increased flow of information than democratic institutions have. So, for example, the way that Audrey Tong in Taiwan has put it is that the sort of bit rate of democracy has not increased, right? The input that we give to our democratic systems is still just a few votes every couple of years or something like that, whereas the amount of informational input that we're putting into technological platforms, the amount of information that markets are taking in, for example, has increased just exponentially. So that means that democracy is just at a disadvantage to these other kinds of institutions if it doesn't figure out how to take in more information. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about this sort of theory of the problem, and whether it's possible to whether it's what we might do to help democracy keep up with these other systems.
No, it's a very interesting hypothesis. I think, well, it's one part. I think there is a risk if we only think of democracies through metaphors of information systems, because it's much more symbolic, there's much more perceptions and experiences at play. But then again, there is that aspect as well. And I think it's quite nuanced, actually. Of course, if we look at it on a very kind of like macro level, that would be the case, that the input values would be quite rude. At the same time, when we look back, for instance, when democracies responded to the wave of telecommunications technologies that emerged, it was a process of institutional design that took a decade or 15 years just to put in place the structures, the basic agencies, in order to be able to regulate and understand the nuance with those technologies. I think that's the process where we are right now. And then what I'm worried about is, well, first of all, how long it takes, because now the pace seems to be a bit faster, or at least the existing institutional landscape and culture seems not to be able to grapple with all those dynamics that are at play. For instance, in the fragmentation of the media landscape, which is a really difficult problem for the current democratic institutions, because it goes on to a level of perceptions that are very difficult to deal with a formal electoral system, for instance. But that doesn't mean that it's not taken into account. It's just taken into account in pockets, and it's not that visible. But perhaps to that point, it would be that there is that process of institutional design. It takes time, because that's one of the key features of democracy. And then what the end results will be most likely vary quite a bit on context.
Yeah, I mean, I think another sort of theme that comes up in this context is like, so there's a lot of talk about sort of education and like the inculcation of like a democratic culture or a democratic spirit. And this is, for example, this is something that John Dewey was really interested in, was like, how to kind of create a culture of interaction and communication between people in which democracy could thrive. But I think it's difficult because there's obviously something to that, but I also worry about that a lot, because I don't think it will. I'm not sure that first of all, I just worry about basically going to societies and saying that there's something wrong with the way that people are interacting with their politics, right? I don't think you want to blame people in that way, first of all, and second of all, I actually think that that with better sort of fora for participation, with better, if we have better spaces of participation, people actually will, part of the reason people don't embody the democratic spirit is that they don't have an outlet to do so, right? They don't have any forum in which they can do that. And so, Stav, I know you have thought a lot about like the role of cities and local government in this, and I don't know if you have thoughts about participation in local government as this kind of a sort of a forum for participation.
Yeah, many thoughts about it, but before that, I want to say something about your question. I think it goes back to I think it's the most basic question about politics and leadership, and that's the fact that eventually most people choose to not be active. Most people choose to not go to that demonstration. Most people choose to stay at home. Most people, and we see also more and more that people choose not to even go and vote for the national elections. Municipal elections are even a harder temptation to get people to vote. But it goes even beyond that. We have an incredible tech industry around the world. But how many of the people who are actors in this industry, that lead the industry, dedicate an hour a week to use the skills that they have, the talents that they got, in order to improve democratic practices, in order to influence the society that they live in? I remember something that was really painful, I think we talked about it a few days ago, when in the Great Hack, the documentary that was made about Cambridge Analytica, a company that used personal data on Facebook to become very influential in national elections in different countries. I think it's in over 60 countries. They helped Trump win, they helped Brexit be passed, they participate, Bolsonaro in Brazil, they helped a lot of populist leaders to win using that personal data on Facebook and changing, basically focusing on swing votes. And the Great Hack documentary starts with that woman, her last name is Kaiser, and she's in Burning Man. She's in a festival that's all about free love and openness and a community, and she defines herself as a liberal. She volunteered for the Obama campaign when she was a student, but then she became a manager at Cambridge Analytica. And when she goes back from that Burning Man, she goes back to the company that she works for, and she participates in helping Trump win using that personal data. She participates in all of these actions that promoted very, very populist, anti-democratic leaders around the world. She made a complete separation. I mean, after that, she became and defined herself as a whistleblower, but that was only after the whole thing exploded. She, as a person with those very democratic values, decided to act in her profession, in her job, completely for the other side. And I could never get that separation that people make in their lives. Because we are, as citizens, we're always citizens. It's not like our citizenship ends when we go to work. We're citizens there. And I think I see in the tech industry and in the startup industry, also in my country, in Israel, a lot of people who go to a very libertarian ideology. So they distance themselves ideologically from the sense of government and why it's important, instead of using the skills that they have to help change government. Government really needs to be fixed, definitely. It's not working well in many, many, many places, but it needs that creativity to act. And I think that's part of the reason that brought me to believe in the potential of cities. I think because governments are now, in so many places, are in complete chaos. If it's ongoing election rounds, if it's ongoing shifts of power and the lack of ability to promote serious ideas and policies. But municipalities are in a different place. They have much more stability. Sometimes they're even being ignored but by mistake or not taking enough power into their hands. But they have the potential of doing that. We saw it when Trump left the Paris agreements, and 2,000 municipalities in the US decided to join and take on climate responsibility, because that's what their people asked them to do. So municipalities today can actually lead. They can lead the world. They can create collaborations in between them. They can share tools. They can show, they can do participatory budget, for example, which is the best training to make people, that's when the municipality gives certain neighborhoods, usually the lowest income neighborhoods, a certain amount of their budget, of the municipal budget, to make a decision, a democratic decision in the neighborhood, what they want to build. And that process, if it's done well, it's a process that's really educating the city to participate, because it gives them power, it gives them a sense of success. They suddenly see that something can actually work, and they created it, and it's exciting. And I think it goes from there. It's by making democracy exciting. It will not work just because, you know, it has this idea of importance, because then people make it very superficial. Democracy is much more than just the majority vote. But it will work if it will become sexy and exciting again.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important, so first of all, RadicalxChange does a lot of work with cities precisely because they have an ability to be a little bit more experimental. And I also think an important idea here is that it's important for democracy to happen sort of in this, at many different levels of sort of distance from the individual. So if you think about, I mean, it's particularly acute in the United States. You can feel the enormous scale gap between the, you know, democracy of 350 million person society and the individuals. Just, it feels, and what's interesting about it and quite scary is that that the sort of national level inspires huge passion. People are extremely passionate about it, and yet they actually feel like no sense of responsibility for it. So there's this sort of gap between how much you care about it, how passionate you feel about it, and how much responsibility you feel for what happens at that level. Because it's just very hard to take seriously the idea that what I do has any impact at an institution of that scale. So having these other kinds of, having democracy really functioning and flowing at these sort of meso levels of society, I think is incredibly important. I want to make sure, I would love to, I think an important ingredient in this conversation is to hear a little bit about the greatly admired work in Estonia, which is, one of the leaders in the world in terms of creating new methods of participation. And Kazimierz, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Estonia indeed is the poster child of digital administrations, e-states, and so on. Basically, if I would use one of PR messages of Estonian government, they always claim that Estonian citizen can do anything online except two things: getting married and getting divorced. So that's two public services that they are not offering online. And indeed, Estonians for more than 20 years, they employ all kinds of services. They can do basically anything. And one of the service they offer is online voting, internet voting. And I guess it's the only country in the world that offers this opportunity. They introduced online voting as a way of casting vote in 2005. So it's already 17 years that they use this. So far, they didn't have any problems with this, but I have some thoughts on this. And one of my thoughts is that this, or conclusions from observing the process, is that this digital solution helped people who already know and plan to cast a vote. So they need to have their candidate that they want to vote for. And the introduction of internet voting haven't really influenced turnout, only to some small level. So in Estonia, usually in national elections, turnout is somewhere between 55 and 65%. Which is pretty good for Central European countries, but in comparison with Western European countries, they are still lagging behind in terms of number, in terms of turnout. Introducing internet voting haven't really influenced on a form of government. It haven't changed the role of citizen in share of power. It haven't really increased accountability of political agents, political parties, politicians, and so on. So in this case, technology is a facilitator that helps those who already have agency, that those who want to participate in elections, but does not necessarily influence democracy as a whole.
Do you think there's something do you think that there's something that it's missing? Do you think that there's something that the Estonian government could do or should do to make it better and to make it something that affects more people's sense of responsibility for the outcomes, or no?
For the turnout, or for more active participation in the democratic process?
Yeah, I think what I'm interested in more than just turnout is sort of whether it changes the character of the society, right? Whether the availability of these new tools and new forums for participation has affected the.
There are more services than iVoting that were supposed to influence democratic process in Estonia. I should mention that about the approach that the Estonian state employed. Basically, everything that they introduce as a digital service, public e-service, is conducted as in top-down approach. So basically, the government is deciding, like, let's introduce i-voting, and they are introducing i-voting. Let's introduce e-notary system, and they are doing this. It's probably completely different than we would prefer as a democratic-oriented societies to have these grassroots initiatives, down-to-top approach, sorry, bottom-up approach. But in Estonia it's different way, and it's fascinating that people trust these services and they accept them, they use them. But that does not increase their feel of connection or need to participate even more in democratic process just because there is i-voting. Estonian governments over the years, over more than 20 years, offered 4 platforms for online participation in legislative process and in public consultations. The first one they introduced was 2001. It was called TOM, abbreviation from Estonian for Today I Vote, but it failed. People didn't want to use this. But I found, I read one opinion that it was too early to implement such a platform. It was 3 years before Facebook, and the author who claimed that it was too early, he actually claimed that society didn't know how to use this. But despite this, there were other platforms that the Estonian government introduced over the years, and people really didn't use them in a way that government wanted to. The recent initiative is called Rahvaalgatus, introduced in 2014, and it was introduced after national brainstorming. What Estonian society could do differently in order to make the Estonian democracy work better. And actually this national brainstorming ended up with very little result. So if I remember correctly, the initiative was of president of the country back then, and but this Rahvaalgatus was one of the effects of this national brainstorming, and the effects of this platform are more or less 10 up to 15 legislation initiatives that end up in parliamentary agenda, and I have data only of first 4 years of working of this platform. So over the first 4 years, only 2 ideas end up as they were introduced as a law in the country. One of them was dedicated to preserving biodiversity in the country. The other one I don't remember. So very little effect. So these new technologies, platforms, they actually haven't influenced, they haven't made Estonian society participate more. And I mentioned before that all of the digital services are introduced in this top-down approach, and one of the conclusion or lessons from this is that new technology doesn't really help society participate more, and in Estonian society, people who use them are actually consumers of what the government offers to them.
Yeah, I think this is a really important distinction that I'm interested in a lot of contexts, the distinction between sort of thinking of the government as a service provider versus thinking of the government as something of which I'm a part
for example, right? And so,
exactly. One of the conclusions of scientists who were investigating these platforms in University of Tallinn was that these platforms need to have measurable result, or result that could be materialized in a way that people who participate in this, they feel that they had their part in introducing new law or certain change. And previous platforms, they didn't provide this. So people felt kind of detached. So people need to feel that they are part of the process in order to own the platform or own the tool.
and so I'm just curious, like how would you sort of, from a broader point of view, how would you characterize this sort of health of Estonian democracy compared to peer countries? And has the work on digital democracy sort of made any difference one way or the other in that regard?
So if we talk about digital democracy, and if we would take the definition of digital democracy as a system where new forms of communication and providing information is employed, then Estonia is doing very well. But it doesn't influence much of agency in individual citizens. So that's one point. The other point is that I would say that Estonian democracy is doing really well in general terms. In these more traditional, broader terms, the media landscape is, for such a small country, is quite diverse, and media are basically free. In ranks of media freedoms, Estonia is top 5 in the world right now. If you would compare media landscape, they are in the same group as Scandinavian countries or New Zealand and so on. So the most liberal and the most free countries. Internet freedom, they are also top 5, top 10. Economical freedoms is all. Estonia is all in all of these ranks in top 10, top 15, top 5. They have very good education system, and there is a very high level of digital literacy, which help them use all these tools. But despite this, the country and the society has problems very much similar to any other countries. So, for example, Poland is not that advanced in terms of e-state as Estonia, but we have very similar problems concerning new political movements, populistic movements, or politics based on emotions and conflict rather than idealistic politics that we have a little bit maybe in 90s. So, and these traditional or global problems are also there, but so far Estonia is doing, in my opinion, very good. They still are able to discuss very pragmatic problems on the level of national politics. Their society is able to influence political agendas. They have a number of issues that there is broad consensus, and these are actually very good ideas. Like, there is very broad consensus that education needs to be on a very high level, that they have to invest in ICT technologies in public and private sector, that they have to maintain freedoms of media, of doing business, of freedom of speech, and so on. So it's in comparison with Central European countries, they are doing good. There is, of course, quite a lot to do. Maybe in terms of social education, in order to make people be more active in terms of participating not only in elections but also in political process and decision-making processes.
Thanks. Would love to open it up to questions, if anyone would like to ask a question.
Could you repeat? I haven't heard you.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So you were talking about how... Perfect. So you were talking about how the government is providing these e-services from the top down, right? And that you've found fascinating that the citizens just accepted those tools.
Yeah, okay.
Why is that?
I would say that there is many factors that are behind this. It's basically a question of trust. Society, citizens trust their government. They not necessarily trust politicians or political parties, but they trust their government as an institution, state as an institution, and numerous institutions like police, courts, schools, and so on. They trust their institutions. And I think there is a lot of political, cultural, and historical context to this. Why they trust? So basically, Estonia regained independence in 1991 after half a century of Nazi and Soviet occupations. So they don't have memory of their own government betraying them or breaching their trust. They associate this negative impact, this negative phenomenon or actions with Soviet rule, which Estonian society always took as a foreign invading power. So when they started their reforms in the 90s, they were, finally it was their own government. Their own people were governing. The other factor, it might be that they are a very small society. They are just 1.3 million people. So if you have so small society, you have to trust each other because most probably they are your friends, relatives, and so on. And it's probably more difficult to betray in such a small society. The other factor is education. They put from the very beginning huge pressure on educating people, not only reforming schools, providing schools with computers and so on, but they offer digital literacy courses also for adult citizens. And the digital literacy is on a very high level in Estonia, so maybe they know better how to use them, but it still doesn't translate on higher participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Hello? Hello? Thank you so much. We're going to close the panel here, and now we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 11:30 for a conversation on user agency in democratic data. So you can go take a break, grab a coffee, and come back here in 5. And thank you so much.
got no doubt anymore. How do I get a feeling out of control? How do I know for sure? My intuition's pulling me through. I got no doubt anymore.
Welcome back. We're going to get started. And this is going to be a conversation about user agency and democratic data. I think that most people can agree that our digital platforms should not be controlling our lives, but when we talk about what could be alternatives to the platforms that we have today, then there are many misalignments. So, for instance, some people want more user agency and individual control of data. Others see almost all data as shared and interpersonal. And so in this panel, we're going to discuss these new paradigms and what are some of the conflicts between different approaches for data governance and data ownership. So our moderator is Alek Tarkowski. Dr. Alek Tarkowski is a digital activist, strategist, and sociologist of technology. He's a co-founder and strategy director of the Open Future think tank. And he also sits at the board of directors of Creative Commons and chairs the oversight board of the Centrum Cyfrawi, a Polish digital think and do tank. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay, more or less. He was had a strategic advisory role in the Polish office of the Prime Minister, and he was a member of the European Commission expert group on AI and data in education. Alek's work focuses on strategies and public policies through which digital technologies are shaped to maximize public benefit. So, Alex, thank you so much for moderating this panel, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, and my first thought is that I should now make as extensive introductions of our guests, but that would require me to go into improvisation and freestyle, so I won't do that. I actually had a different plan. The way we'll run this session is that I'll make a short setting of the scene, and then each of the speakers will have a chance to speak, which gives them a very nice opportunity to highlight those aspects of their work and themselves which they want to share. And I actually think also your ideas here are more interesting than the bios, which are of course also relevant. So what I like about this event today is that it sort of weaves around this theme of democracy and pluralism, a lot of ideas that are interesting for me and are also key for our societies. And data, which is the topic of this session, is one of them. Now, maybe we will vary in this room how exciting it is. Probably everyone will agree that the art sessions are super cool. I don't know how many in the room think data is super cool, but I think the panelists do. And that's why I'm happy to have this conversation with Katarzyna Szymielewicz from Panoptykon Foundation, Joanna Rutkowska from Golem Foundation and Wildland IO, and Sille Sepp from My Data Foundation as well. Yes. What we want to discuss today is sort of data governance in the shadow of the great commercial platforms, because I hope that's actually something we all agree here in this room, that we're having this conversation in a very particular time when our data is being held, extracted, exploited, some will even say, by great companies which control our data and therefore sort of control our lives, because maybe that's another important assumption to make here, especially that we'll be talking about users. Users in today's reality are flesh and blood people, but they're also some kind of a cloud of data, collection of data, catalog of data, you name it, which represents them, which connects with them. So when we talk about data governance, this is today very personal, right? It's not just about how do we govern. It's also relevant debates about, let's say, industrial data, non-personal data, but it's also a lot about just us represented by data, being data. So we want to talk today about alternatives, and I think with discussing these alternatives, we're sort of in a place which Matt described earlier, talking about Spain. I don't know if this is a good analogy or not. I'm always anxious about with analogies that regard war and the military, but we sort of live in a time when we need to make them. But when you talked about these divisions within a movement that can be very hard, that's sometimes how debates among progressive data governance activists feels like. We really have our pet projects, pet approaches, pet challenges. What I hope we can do today a bit is explore these various takes. I know that the three of you are interested in different approaches to alternative data governance. You have different ideas of what really counts. You know, if you follow these debates, some people really care about sovereignty. Some people want to talk about monetization, seeing it as a fair way to reward people. Other wants to really still focus on protections, and something protection of data is a lost cause and we need to move forward and maybe talk about things like access or availability of data. So I hope we can explore a bit these approaches and maybe even look at some tensions or maybe positive connections. And one question I'll surely raise, because we have this starting point of platforms, there's someone here from a wonderful Czech institution called Paralelní Polis, and that's a wonderful theoretical idea created by Václav Benda, a Czech communist-era progressive thinker, who said that if it's impossible to change the dominant system, you build a parallel polis, a parallel alternative, somewhere hiding on the margins, in the different cracks. It's a very beautiful idea, but one which assumes that you really cannot change the system. And this is something I will also want to explore during this session. Are we talking about really alternatives, as in, you know, weird new spaces somewhere in the margins, autonomous zones, and so on, or really the prerequisite step is somehow to change this dominant situation and do something with platforms. I know this is something you also think about. But okay, let's maybe start. I would like each of you to sort of talk a bit about your perspective. What's your take on data governance? What are you experimenting with, working on, paying attention to? And maybe we'll start with you, Sille.
Can you hear me? Yes? Very good. So hi everyone, I'm Sille. As already mentioned, I work in the organization called My Data Global, which is a non-profit organization. We work internationally and advocate for the topic of human-centric approach to personal data. We do that by then bringing a very broad network of stakeholders together to really, let's say, build the scene, the set, and also the solutions and the backstage to empower individuals with their data. So we don't necessarily directly provide those services to individuals as from our end. But what is important for us is that when we look at those solutions, we really want to bring those mainly 4 different perspectives together. We talk about the business perspective, the business models, economics, all of that angle, the legal and governance issues, of course the technology that needs to underpin all of those different solutions, and then also what we importantly want to look at is the societal implications that all of this then has. So we really look at all of those pillars that we don't only start to think that one, let's say, perspective would be the savior of these challenges. So when we look at the data governance, I think if I reflect back, for me, it seems that this topic of data governance is getting traction beyond the usual suspects, first of all, and it's really great to see that the discussion is also going from the mere need to protect data to actually a more nuanced way of also how do we use data and still keep the agency for individuals and groups. And in our context, we really want to see this as a both-and discussion. So it's not only about the need for, or the viewpoint for individuals and groups that they have the right for privacy and hence they need to protect and maybe even constrain the use of data, but actually also an inherent right to benefit from that data. So also when we take a more broader or bigger picture of how society is organized or economy is organized, people are often described as users or consumers. And this is a very organization-centric view to describe people. From our perspective, especially when we look at the personal data, we want to see actually that I want to influence how we could start looking at data actually from the perspective of individuals and communities' interest, their expectations, their really meaning of how to purposefully use that data then. So to bring all of this a little bit also more concrete, we work in My Data Global in a very, also with different intermediary models and governance models, because the data management and data sharing is very complex topic. It's also very complex in terms of management and sharing how this should happen across organizations, and we believe and see that some sort of assistance or support is needed for individuals. And in that My Data model then what we've looked at, there is a role for operators or data intermediation services as it's now called in the Data Governance Act. And we see those intermediary services as enablers. One of its enablers of really protecting the data and making consent, for example, more actionable. But on the other hand, it's also actually an enabler for value creation, because those intermediaries can help with matchmaking different service providers so that actually the possibility to create new innovative services starts to arise. And those operators or data intermediation services are nothing new or conceptual only. They're been existing in the market already for many, many years. And again, in the context of our work, we've ran a operator award process for now 3 years. And in total, already 41 service providers have also received that award. So from that work that we really do on the ground from bottom up to understand how those different governance models and services are implemented, we see that those are very, very different service providers, but they have also some similar or core functionalities that they offer. And what is interesting for us is actually to start seeing how then, based on those functionalities, we start to also move towards interoperability between those intermediation services, because interoperability helps to open up those ecosystems, those collaborations, and bring right away more freedom of choice, both for individuals as well as organizations, how they exchange data. So maybe just to wrap up, I see that it's already going quite long from my end. If I need to point out maybe 3 main points that we are looking towards in terms of data, but also data governance, is that those 3 shifts that are described in the Maïmonatou Declaration, moving from just formal rights to actionable rights. This is when I talk about really having those enablers that help to bring all of those solutions to very convenient ways of exercising those rights. Then the second shift is actually moving from just protecting data to actually empowering individuals and communities with their data. And then finally, actually moving from closed to open ecosystems. And here I talk about this freedom of choice, level playing field, all of those different angles that are necessary for data governance. So yeah, I'll stop here, and looking forward to the discussion.
I have one quick question. Because you have a good sort of view of this field of data intermediation. I think part of the challenge of discussing these things is that data can be almost anything. So in terms of trends, is there some dominant focus that these intermediaries take that you can highlight? You know, like what specifically, for instance, the type of data that they intermediate, or an approach that they have?
So first of all, like how we see intermediation services is that they provide the infrastructure, and then there, like I mentioned, those different functionalities that they might focus on permission management, identity management, maybe they also do service management, actually provide personal data stores, or only actually support with this exchange. So these are the different types of functionalities, and there are a total of 9. The use cases are very different. Okay. So they go from basically looking at how data from advertisement could be brought back to individual stores, and so that they can actually share this further, or they go actually into very specific domains like health, or like I don't know, skills, or smart cities, etc. So they still have those very different use cases, and of course the intention is that the use cases grow into actually more cross-sectoral data sharing, because that's where value is created, and the value of data actually increases. Just to mention also what is important, I think, in terms of the intermediation services, is that it needs to be financially sustainable also for them. We look at the intermediation services mainly from individuals, intermediaries for individuals. So they need individuals, and then people need to be the primary beneficiaries for them, but still, intermediation services are also private organizations or companies that need to be able to provide that services, so they cannot be seen only as with the role of public, how you call it, representation that, for example, public sector has. And this said, again, I just want to mention that intermediation is so nuanced again. It can be a non-profit, it can be a collaborative, it actually can be a private company that provides that service. So there are very different ways of organizing this, and also still intermediation. There are others that facilitate mainly intermediation between different ecosystems, different organizations, and we look at primarily for intermediation services that are focused on the individuals.
Okay,
Sorry,
thanks. So that's a broad view, and this is maybe a good moment to shift to you, Joanna, because you in turn are building your own specific solutions. So I'm very curious about your focused take.
Does it work now? Yeah. So you touched on one topic, that empowering user with the data, and you gave some typical examples like healthcare and smart cities. Can you name some more? How to empower a user with access to their data?
In terms of domains where they're exercising?
Is it like, you know, empowering users with access to data as a goal? Can you give some examples other than healthcare or smart cities?
There are varied ones in terms of, like I mentioned already, really retail, for example. There
Like
are
what?
in case
Retail?
retail. There is different types of media.
Does it really empower the users, or does it empower the sellers?
In terms of the view, what we see in terms of empowering individuals is that they get practical tools to understand what data is even gathered, how it's collected, how it's governed, how to also actually get use of sharing this data further. And
so you're saying it empowers me in terms of me understanding how I'm being controlled to buy more stuff?
Not necessarily, because of course, that goes into the governance and the legislation as a whole. What are also the different data rights? And what I mentioned about this kind of formal to actionable rights that we work towards is that it cannot be that complicated to just that it's granted with legislation, but that there are also practical tools for that with services for individuals and communities to get access to that data and potentially then also move it further to other stakeholders.
But do what with this data?
Can I?
Okay, I'm asking those questions because I have an important point to make. Hopefully, it's becoming clear that data itself is boring. I mean, data itself is a buzzword these days, but really, I don't really care much about data. What I really care about myself as a thinking person is information. Information is structured data. It's data that is, well, somehow like a book, like a story, like a drawing, like a blueprint, like a theory. That's information. What I'm really after is the information that is really digested by my brain, by my mind, which is called knowledge. And I'm really for the knowledge because the knowledge for me is one of the top goals. Apart from other goals like maybe beauty and love, knowledge is a goal worth pursuing. So now, once you start thinking about how we as individuals go through our lives and we acquire our history and some knowledge, some tastes, some likes, this all is kind of like a large pieces of information. And now, if we look at how we interact with information today, is we interacted through different kinds of apps and services. And it turns out that all those apps and services are guardians to the information that makes us us. If you sign up to the theory that my I, myself, my consciousness is really a stream of information, then we are moving increasingly towards a situation where information that makes me is spread among third parties. For example, I'm using a few very cool applications for knowledge management, One is Bear for organizing my nodes. Another is Muse for spatial thinking and also organization of information. But other people use some others, like artists might be using Procreate or Photoshop. Others might be using editors. And all this information is super important to me. But I'm forced to accept that the information that I'm producing, for example, for several years I've been creating a very vast node system about my life, about knowledge I'm learning, and I'm being forced to have this knowledge system stored on iCloud Drive just because Bear app that I'm using as primary organizer of my knowledge just forces me to using Apple iCloud Drive. I'm using also Remarkable for thinking, and I'm actually forced to use Remarkable cloud service, which comes with Remarkable, which actually uses, I think, Google Cloud Platform these days. And really, if Remarkable decides to cut me off, I'm lost, like hundreds of my nodes is lost. And now, notice the difference between like a node, like a visual creation that I just made, which is a reflection of my thoughts and of myself. The value of this kind of data, which is super important, and I think on a different level than data about like how many steps I did yesterday when I was going to work. This data, like this low-level data, is like, well, it's good to have some control of it. Well, of course, it's good that it's not being leaked to, I don't know, third parties, so I'm not being bombarded with all kinds of advertising for new sneakers, whatever. But it's really, 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 really on a different league of importance than the information that I have produced and is important for my life, like my notes, like my photos, like my whatever other creations of my mind. And so going to explaining what I'm doing professionally at Golem Foundation, we are working on Wildland, which hopes to be an infrastructure for both organization and storage of your information on your own terms. And I can tell more in the next iteration.
Okay. Thanks. Sounds like some connection points with things that we talk a lot, so I know are important for you. So what's your story, Kasia, and where's your microphone? Here it is, okay.
Okay, waiting for the microphone, maybe this one. Thank you. I have the privilege of talking first, so I can relate to problems that were sketched both by Sille and Joanna. My background is in law. I represent Panopticon Foundation, but also for quite a long time I've been on the board of the whole coalition we have across Europe with office in Brussels called European Digital Rights. And as digital rights defenders, that's how we frame ourselves, and lawyers/geeks, we have both in the network. We've been preoccupied with trying to answer to the challenges of hosting, controlling the data, or as you prefer call it, information, structured information about humans. But even more so, we've been concerned about protecting these humans from getting manipulated, surveilled, trapped in profiling, and then content curation that controls their lives by the third parties that track them, or the first parties, the service providers, because both roles are problematic or have been problematic throughout the time we observed, which is last 20 years. So for us, the milestones in these battles have been GDPR, which is the upgrade of very, very old data protection regulation. I still think is a useful legal framework. I do not think that GDPR is to blame for the cancer of internet, which is the bloody pop-ups and all the hell of tracking. The idea behind that law was to eliminate that all. It's a separate conversation why the framework failed, but the failure is the market failure and the execution failure, not legal framework failure. But okay, the time we are moving on. We notice the difference between data controlled by different entities and our power to move that data, to port it to different places, to control, in a sense that I can go to Facebook and correct the input data I give to Facebook. I can do that, but we all know it's not going to change anything really, because the power over data evolved with the time, with the development of AI models, machine learning, statistical methods, all that does not really fit on personal data in the sense that GDPR acknowledges. So the observations that algorithms across the board are designed to detect about humans, that knowledge about human beings and the trends they follow, the behavior, the mental patterns, does not have to be personal. And from that perspective, this is another battle to control who controls the knowledge rather than who stores my data on which server and whether the server is secure or whether I prefer to have it under my desk. I can move my personal data, the ones I generate, wherever I want. Obviously, it's really good to have independent places. From that perspective, I respect and admire both projects that you ladies described. But from my perspective, somebody defending humans against surveillance and manipulation, this is not enough, because what is my challenge is to cut the tracking and the observation that happens beyond my production of data. It happens through CCTV, it happens through sensors, it happens in the traffic, like city traffic, it happens on airports, and it happens online, but it is based on behavioral observation, which is something I can't control, even if I have a personal data pod and a sharing model and a cloud of my choice and all that. So how to approach this problem? We came up with this concept that I think is already present in the debate for a while, but we've been evolving with this, which is unbundling large platforms. Why do we look at large platforms like Google, Amazon, Facebook? Not because we like them so much that we want them to stay. We just acknowledge the fact that most of the surveilled individuals across the globe, including wealthy Europe, will stay there. It might be, renamed something else. I'm pretty sure that Facebook will cease to exist sooner than we regulate them. But something else with the same business model, which is exploitation, manipulation, control over behavioral data in order to create profit, will continue. So we need to address them. And our concept in the network is the following: let's give them the hosting of the data. If people want to host data on something else, on another server, even better. But let's unbundle the layers. So even if people choose to host their pictures on WhatsApp or whatever, like Instagram, okay, that's not so problematic from our perspective as the interface that they have to use in order to communicate with the rest of the world. The interface is the key factor in the power game, right? Because this is the interface that makes me addicted, that encourages me to share more than I want, that creates certain power asymmetries or issues like people engaging with the content that harms them, because the content that is harmful is actually visible more and suggested more frequently than the informative quality content. We all know that. So the interface, the algorithm, and the commercial layer on the top of everything, which is advertising, needs to be unbundled. And then we can discuss on each layer different models of empowerment. With hosting, I fully agree. Personal data pod or another place where I control my data, very good idea. But the behavior observation, not solved. So the interface where the behavior observation happens, that interface layer also needs to be open for empowerment. And here we suggest that independent providers come to something like Facebook or YouTube with their own algorithm that does not do all these evil things. And with the advertising, I respect the fact that some people will not be able or willing to pay for the content, for access to content or social networks. Fair enough, but they can still opt for advertising model that works like Netflix, where you identify categories that you are okay with, instead of being tracked and manipulated by third party doing, cross-site tracking. So in short, this is the kind of solution we are seeking and discussing now on Brussels level. There are interesting legislative openings, including Data Act, that would definitely give space for things like Wildland and MyData.org. I'm sure you follow that. So, it's interesting time because many things that happen in Brussels exactly respond to problems you both described, not yet go as far as I would like this to go. There is no unbundling mandated yet, but, well, the battle is not finished.
Joanna, what do you think about this blueprint or this idea of an ecosystem?
Yeah, of course, enforcing platforms to expose public APIs interfaces you're talking about is absolutely an idea we should be pursuing and regulating. That's for sure. But let's assume we have solved that. 5 years from now, every big platform has an API. I can have access to my photos on Messenger. I don't use Messenger, but let's say I used, whatever. Now, the real question is that we humans got used to being, well, we are lazy creatures, of course, and we got used to being offered almost everything we should be consuming by third parties. We don't think about what book we want to read. We just expect Amazon or Goodreads to give us a recommendation. We expect Google to give us a recommendation for a restaurant nearby and a movie to see, etc. So if we now, let me go back. Even with those interfaces, someone will have to do that. Someone, some program, some platform, maybe platforms. The question is, how we envision this being done. Do we want the future where we move this control? This again shows my different thinking, like me thinking about structured information versus thinking about low-level data. Because low-level data, what Katarzyna said, problem solved with APIs, almost solved. But when we go now to this higher level of what is data, it's structured information, the question is who dictates us, who tells us, who recommends us how to consume this whole universe of information that our world is made of? Who makes us what to read, what to watch, what to think, where to go? So this is an important question. I know if we have time to elaborate it, maybe you have some ideas.
I just quickly answer, because maybe it wasn't clear that the answer, I tried to give it already. So in the model I described, you can choose your governor or your filter. You can even create it yourself. If you have capacity as a network like this one, you can probably design that filter,
sure,
right? So there is no, today, we don't have choice. We have one curator.
The only problem is, I mean, that sounds good, and it sounds appealing for a person like myself, who is a technical, who can program. But what I'm afraid of is that in order to write a good, say, a movie recommender or book recommender, you would need to be someone like Google or Facebook. You would need to have this kind of machinery running in the cloud, knowing all that they know about us today, to be such a good recommender. And what's the other option then? And here is my pitch, Wildland pitch, is that give the tools to the user how to navigate among this complex informational universe. And this is what we do with Wildland and also Aleph 6, which is a sub-project of Wildland about unification of information. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
I'll just jump in for a second. What I think I need to put into this conversation, especially that we have the word democratic data governance, is some form of community. Because, and even I must say with my data, I really like your model, but, and I think it's not your goal, because I think you're just creating a broad framework, but among the intermediaries, I would like to see more who sort of try to drive this community approach. It's also something that I find interesting in what I think of as the post-GDPR conversation, that we see some limits to this individual approach. A person stands up and says, hey, make my data portable, takes it out and knows what to do with it. At the same time, you know, it's easy to say community, and some communities are easy to define. I think it's not surprising we have a lot of discussions about basically Uber data, because it's very easy to say who's the community of Uber drivers, who could be also drivers aligned by a different platform. But also, you know, I find fascinating the conversations happening in more cultural space, where you find out that, for instance, musical genres, which always build communities, are now defined algorithmically, and the company like Spotify sometimes doesn't know what to call them. You know, there's this idea of scissor labels, right? That these names, it's no longer like punk, but really you come up with neologisms because the algorithm shows you that these 5 bands create a culture. So I think there's something very hard about community, and at the same something when I hear about alternative, about information and knowledge, I would like to build it not only myself, but some group of people, but which one I don't know. And I want someone to tell me. We have a bit more time. Sille, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you for this discussion. It's really inspirational, and I think we're not very far off actually with our viewpoints also, because I presented from my data side one angle of work that we do with the intermediation services. But of course, the whole idea around my data and the human-centric approach to personal data was the point that in the context of personal data, the viewpoint, if we start to look at it from the perspective of individuals and communities, then we start to also see that we need different and alternative ways of organizing this. And that of how do we organize it is not only the job of intermediaries, or it's not only the job of legislators or different types of organizations, but it's a very multi-layered approach. We need to look for how to raise in terms of data literacy, even to understand how data is embedded into our society. All of those different angles need to become important. And I wanted to maybe point out one thing that actually started building up in my head based on the previous session. I'm actually from Estonia, so it was very interesting to listen to interpretations of Estonian case of the digitalization. And one of the statements that was made was that it's many of the services are actually from top down. Of course, I haven't built those myself, so I don't know the real intention behind this, but what I can reflect back is that there's also the level of understanding that we want to make lives easier, and we want to make certain services seamless. And hence, it can start to feel that something is provided to us, something is happening in the background, because then that allows us to live the life that we want to live and focus on other intentions. This said, this cannot go into a black box. It cannot go into something that things are organized on behalf of us only, so that there is also mechanisms for taking collective action, to inquire information. So all of these aspects of transparency and accountability and so forth is important to keep in mind. And I believe that in the Estonian case, often it is as well. So the point is not about Estonia, but really the aspect that I find that it's always a balancing act between different interests, and the balancing act of also in terms of different mechanisms that we start to put in play, so that we could actually start moving to a vision that we have jointly. So we, like in terms of legislations, we see now a tsunami coming in Europe with Markets Act, Data Act, Data Governance Act. All of these try to cover different angles of it, but then it goes into actual implementations of how this will put into practice from the organizations and company side. So like as you pointed out, in terms of, for example, the markets failure, how we avoid that there would be a markets failure now also with the new tsunami that comes out in terms of legislation.
I, 'cause, 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 'cause,
I can make some maybe unrelated remarks. Still, one thing I wanted to point out is that recommendations for movies, books, restaurants is one thing. But remember that we are also thinking beings, meaning that we also sometimes want to learn something non-trivial. Imagine yourself going back to university and wanting to learn something as complex as high math, say a topology. How would you go about it? You would start doing probably notes, right? Drawing some diagrams, putting some notes. You would put it into some note-taking app, like, for example, I would recommend Muse, for example. It's a great app for that. Then this is part of you. But over the years, you would have such things like over and over again if you are an intellectual worker. And this all would make you, and this is significantly more difficult to give a user a tool to navigate among those accumulated knowledge than just write a recommender for a movie or a good book. I think this is clear. And you might think that, well, okay, but you are all like 30s, in your 30s, 40s, and you never had to look back to your school notes, I guess. Well, perhaps the fact that most of us are just sliding on this little surface of understanding of knowledge doesn't mean that it wouldn't be nice to be able to actually have more understanding at your fingertips. I would love this desire. I admit that when I was at school, I never actually made, or almost never made notes, because I thought I could remember and come up with a theorem just on the fly. Now I regret it, and now when I'm learning new disciplines or going back to learning math again, I'm actually making lots of notes. And this is super important to have tools that will allow future us to navigate amongst this. Because if we don't have such tools, if we all rely on something like Google, or maybe a third-party recommender or answerer your questions, you ask, what's the Gauss-Bonnet theorem? And you get, oh, this theorem about whatever in topology. And then oh, by the way, and remember, this is relates to this graph theory and the Euler number. Ah, okay. And just forget about it in a moment. But then think about who actually does this thinking. Is it really you thinking? Is it really you understanding topology? Or is it someone who gives you this answer, the Google? Or maybe it's some third-party Google. Doesn't matter, it's not you. So I think that we, the humanity, we are at the danger of actually debraining ourselves and becoming just bodies executing commands by, whoever will be telling us what to think, what to enjoy, what to understand, what to answer. That's.
I have this collective perspective, so I started thinking about Wikipedia. What you talk about people building this collective knowledge, I think you should talk with Wikipedians and they could do things better based on your
Wikipedia is an interesting example, but have you ever had this moment of like, oh, this is so fun and beautiful reading Wikipedia? Would you? No. Wikipedia is meh. It's like boring. It's also too in-depth, too detailed. Like I almost never can learn a complex concept by reading his Wikipedia article. I can learn difficult concepts by reading a textbook or doing math.
Fortunately, like in
Wikipedia. My point is Wikipedia, because it is a collective work, it's neither fun, nor beautiful, nor engaging. So I just don't believe collective mind would be happy if it ever existed.
So we got quite far from data. It reminds me of a quote from a Frank Zappa song where there's like, information is not knowledge, knowledge is not wisdom, and so on. And we talked about all of this, which I'm actually quite happy we did. I also think we only just started. Maybe if anyone wants to talk about user agency and democratic data governance, but also knowledge and wisdom over lunch, I'm happy to do that. And for now, thank you to my great co-speakers in this session.
Thank you so much. We're going to take our 15 minutes. Capitalism for the common good. I'll see you soon.
Tell me something, girl. Are you happy in this modern world? Or do you need more? Is there something else you're searching for? I'm falling. In all the good times I find myself longing for change, and in the bad times I fear myself.
Tell me something, boy. Aren't you tired trying to fill that void? Or do you need more? Ain't it hard keeping it so hardcore? I'm falling. In all the good times I find myself longing for change, and in the bad times I fear myself. I'm of the deep end, watch as I dive in. I'll never meet the ground. Crash through the surface where they can't hurt us. We're far from the shallow now. In the shallow, in the shallow.
before. I don't imagine you're too familiar, and I don't see you anymore. I would not leave you in times of trouble. We never could have come this far, no love. I took the good times, I'll take the bad times, I'll take you just the way you are. Don't go trying some new fashion, don't change the color of your hair. Hey there, you always have my unspoken passion. Although I might not seem to care, I don't want clever conversation, don't want to work that hard, no love. I just want someone to talk to. I want you just the way you are. I need to know that you will always be the same old someone that I do. What will it take till you believe in me the way I believe in you? Yeah, I said I love you, that's forever. This I promise from my heart. Oh Lord, I could not love you any better, yeah. I love you just the way you are. I don't want clever conversation. I don't want to work that hard. No love. I just want someone to talk to. I want you just the way you are. I want you the way.
Gotta say that you're looking good. You know I never meant to hurt you. Well, I'm happier now that I've ever been. I appreciate all your love and concern, but I still feel the pain. Yeah. Time is just a masquerade. Time is just a masquerade. Doesn't hear you like they say. Doesn't hear you like they say. Build our lives, we carry on. Build our lives, we carry on. Love is over when the trust has gone. How can I make things right? I was crazy, young and foolish. Ooh, you don't know what you did. I didn't know that he meant so much to you. Yes, you did, girl. You know I'm sorry and I'll prove it. I wanna believe in the words you say. I'll forgive, I'll try. God knows why, 'cause I still feel the pain. Time is just a masquerade. Time is just a masquerade. It doesn't hear you like they say. No, it doesn't hear you like they say. Build our lives, we carry on. We carry on, we carry on. But love is over when the trust has gone. Looking back on times we had, we used to.
Station right here. This panel is going to be simply about forking capitalism for the common good. And you might have noticed that there's a theme between some of the things that are being talked about here. So earlier today, Matt was talking about how all of the value that, that is in a piece of land, in a piece of land property, comes from the social fabric that is created around it. Then later we were talking about how social media platforms have this sort of outsized power over our data and in shaping our lives. And we were also talking about some of the failures with approaches to technology that don't really consider the culture and the social relationships that underlie them. So one of the things that we are going to talk about in this panel is how our social relationships are the source of almost all value in the world. They are, by definition, increasing return processes, which means that the more we have them, the more value they generate. And they are upstream of economic value in global markets. We admire the achievements of individual entrepreneurs, but social relationships are also the foundation out of which they can create value. And there's a problem with how capitalism is focused on what trickles downstream, so on the consequences, on the outputs of these processes, and in doing that ends up eroding and drying up that critical source of value creation that is our social relationships. So we think that this focus on relationships will be central to new political economies, it will be central to new technologies, and, and will be central to delivering empowerment and real flourishing. So this panel is going to feature 2 examples of relational work and what that looks like. We're going to have here with us Maïmonatou. She is co-founder of the first vocational organization to support and empower women working as nannies in France. And along with her mother, who is a senior nanny, Maïmonatou has built a network of more than 1,000 women who are established in, establishing partnerships with major public and private stakeholders, and they work as a cooperative. Maïmonatou believes that bottom-up initiatives and cooperative models have the power to revive economic and democratic governance. She has launched the French chapter of RadicalxChange, and there she often applies everything that she's learned from her previous experience in science and technology. And then we'll also have Calum, Bowden. The 2 of you are welcome to come to the stage. And Calum is working on stories, worlds, and platforms that reconnect the cultural with the technological, economic, political, and ecological. And he co-founded Trust and Black Swan. So I'm extremely pleased to welcome them to our stage today and to provide a glimpse, hopefully for us, of what relational work looks like. So we're going to start with short presentations of their work, and then they're going to have a conversation, and we'll be lucky to be able to listen in. So I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Calum, and do you want to say hello? So I have some slides. Wonderful, thank you. So I collaborate on a project called Black Swan, and it's very much a collective endeavor. And so all of the things I'll talk about today are enmeshed with these people, Laura Lottie, Penny Rafferty, and Laith Benkeda. And Black Swan exists as an artistic research project, trying to find ways of learning from peer-to-peer networking and decentralization more generally, and thinking about how we might organize art worlds differently and transfer power back to artists who are currently very much exploited within the global art market. Black Swan kind of started from a speculative proposition about what it would look like to have cultural resources distributed following a decision-making system that was entirely controlled by artists. So the initial speculation was, could we have cultural institutions stake resources like residency places, exhibition space, funding into a DAO, and could we have artists decide what they want to do with these resources? And this was kind of a response to our own experiences trying to operate as artists in an increasingly atomized art world. The increasing competition for cultural resources under neoliberalism, also emerging practices that might engage with technology and different ways of working are not really well served or even recognized as art by existing institutional structures. Further, the global art market favors individual practitioners that it's able to create markets around at the expense of the scenes and networks of collaborators that allow these practices to exist in the first place. Meanwhile, institutions, legacy institutions exist as these kind of silos that, and often it will be the same collectors on the boards of all of the institutions who are cherry picking these few artists that they're able to create markets around. And rather, we're interested in how can institutions share resources and infrastructures and tools. And yeah, artists currently have very little control over the data they produce. They have very little benefit from the value produced by their practices. And we also see the value of artistic practice in the process that it goes through in becoming an artwork. And so we're interested in finding ways of kind of foregrounding the process. There's a lot of ideas here. We were interested in blockchains back in 2017 for the potential they afforded, or like we felt it afforded for distributing value differently through networks and allowing the users of a network to in some way benefit from the value that they create. And we were also kind of interested in how this extends beyond national boundaries, can accrue translocal value, is censorship resistant. But at the same time, we're very skeptical of the claims of the blockchain industry. Also, the onboarding is incredibly inaccessible for the vast majority of people who don't have the technical literacy or financial means to access these increasingly expensive networks. And so we wanted to use blockchain as a tool for the imagination, not relying on the technology at all, to really test our assumptions about how art worlds might be organized differently and how we might inject them with democratic decision-making around resource use. And so from this, we kind of devised a 4-part methodology that really places the core emphasis on play. And so we craft experiments to test our assumptions, and we also create role-playing games. As I was mentioning, we do blockchain thinking, so it's kind of taking learnings from technology without being beholden to it, and yeah, really emphasizing the social in anything that is technological. We're also interested in interdependence, and so kind of thinking about ways of creating solidarity amongst artists who are increasingly atomized within the existing market. And then further thinking about DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, as a catalyst for and like a modular way of building democratic organizations. And so some of the experiments that we did over the last few years looked at decision-making, modes of exchange, and ontologies of value. The first was really focusing on decision-making and governance, and we were very excited in 2019 around quadratic voting, but we were skeptical that artists would enjoy using it or that they might feel overwhelmed by it because it's pretty complicated. And so we wanted to kind of test that alongside a more standard one-person, one-vote system and a lottery where we experimented with taking agency away. And so we invited 10 interdisciplinary creative practitioners who are part of the Trust online community in Discord to take part in a 6-week experiment where we asked them to decide how to distribute a very small €300 micro grant with each of these different decision-making systems. And then we had thorough discussions at the end around how it felt and what went well. And we were really kind of surprised to find that the artists really enjoyed quadratic voting, even though they really didn't understand what was going on. And this was a kind of interesting insight for us. And I'll talk more about what we did after, but we wanted to begin prototyping ways of making quadratic voting intuitive to these communities where it feels good to have the ability to express a nuanced preference, even if you don't know exactly what is going on with the quadratic function. And we also found quadratic voting is a really nice way of finding the most preferable compromise within the group. So actually, it was a project looking at biotechnology and thinking about, I'm not remembering all the details, but ultimately everybody kind of liked it a little bit, and everyone was very happy that it was awarded the micro grant. Then we wanted to find ways of simulating and speedrunning organizational structures and seeing what we can learn about how organizations are structured, the roles people play within them, and also how different structures might relate to each other. And so we set up a role-playing game in Berlin with 40 artists, and they were each assigned to one of 4 different organizations, based loosely on the work of a Japanese historian and philosopher called Kojin Karatani. And he revises Marxist thinking around modes of production to focus instead on modes of exchange. And so it's a relational philosophy, thinking about how organizations and how societies relate to each other. And so we took each of Karatani's different modes of exchange and based an organization on them. So we had a clan, we had a guild, we had a cult, and we had a venture. And these were all kind of communes because we were interested in reviving the long European notion of communes as neighborhood units and organizational units. We assigned the artists different roles within these different communes and asked them to decide what to do with about 15 cultural resources that were pledged by different institutions. And we've done other talks on this online, so if you're interested, blackswan.support, but I'll try and give a kind of an overview of the work that we've been doing. We also did an activity focusing on ontologies of value and wanting to expand beyond narrow and reductive market-based values, which are the kind of hegemonic reality of the contemporary art world. And so we wanted to kind of figure out what values different cultural practitioners locate within their processes and try and do mapping exercises around value more generally to think about how value is relational and emerges through process. So we've done other experiments too, often with role-playing games, trying to see how people within organizations will distribute resources, and we try and combine infrastructural development with world building, and the stories we tell about technology are very important to the work that Black Swan has been doing. And I'll kind of try and end with a bit about Signet, which is a quadratic voting tool that we have been prototyping following these experiments that we've been doing. It started more as a kind of, again, a speculation on how could we make the relationship between voice credits and effective votes intuitive and very clear to understand. So these bars are kind of showing you the power of your vote and how many votes you're getting from the voice credits you distribute. We then, over about a year and many prototypes, have a kind of working online platform that works with Discord for user management. It works with Slack also. And we've been using it with artist communities in these mini DAO experiments where cultural institutions will pledge a set of resources And then we asked artists over the course of one moon cycle to decide what to do with those resources. So first they submit a proposal, and then you can vote, and this is kind of the updated interface showing the relationship between voice credits and votes. And something that was very particular about our work is many of the resources are not fungible, so we had to find a way of allowing these discrete things like a year-long radio residency or a mentorship opportunity using quadratic voting, and so we can sort the results according to resources. And this had a really nice effect in currently artists, if you want to do a project, you have to apply for a lot of different opportunities, and you always have to apply to the institution for the opportunity. And what we've done is kind of inverse this, so the institutions have to be organized around the artists and the work that they want to do. And so the proposal links together the resources. I think this is enough for now. We can talk more after.
So, Calum has been like really giving insight about like the situation. It's not working. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Is it better now? Okay, great. So yes, Calum has been really like introducing like the insight about artists. I come from a different perspective, talking about care. Care workers are really like those workers who evolve in the houses of families to provide services. And it has like deep roots, unfortunately, in domesticity and even slavery. This is an activity that is a key activity that we cannot really avoid in our society. We often talk about paid care workers and unpaid care workers because actually those activities are essential to our life. And so 5 years ago with my mother, which is a nanny, we started to think about her situation and the situation of her colleagues to just find a way first to make it visible, to understand why many of workers in this field are unfortunately in precariousness and sometimes modern slavery, and how we can change the situation. So we are talking about capitalism. This domestic work is really like very symbolic actually of capitalism today. And it's an issue that is present all over the world. And so for us, this work was very interesting because we started to just have those conversations with people in different regions of the world having the same issue. And so what was very interesting was the fact that somehow we met some activists that were thinking like, okay, we should just remove this activity and because it's too close to the capitalism spirit. But in fact, it was not the answer because those people having this vocation, even though they came through this activity through very difficult path, sometimes migration path, sometimes it was a question for some women to escape maybe violences from, I don't know, their husband or someone else. So for them, it was also hope to have this opportunity to have a job and to have a job that makes sense for them because they are key workers and really providers of services to those many families. And so somehow we arrived to this kind of challenge, like how can we address this issue of maintaining an activity that is unfortunately very embedded in a domination system. And so from that we started to think about what was important, and what was very interesting was the fact that once the worker gained agency of their situation. Once they get information, once they get access to their rights, things can change. And so we started to think about that, and many of the ideas were about going through a very centralized model for this activity, like a public service, something that is more like maybe in the spirit of socialism, I will say. And it was very, very, it was not relevant actually, because the issue is that you need this form of